We're going to talk about ramps today. So we're going to go through, after I introduce us, what really you're looking at with the different ramps, and what kind of help you might need, and some tips and tricks to get through it. Next slide. Awesome. So I'm Art O'Kane. I'm the field CISO and CIO at Airiam, and this is Rob Carson, and I believe he's founder of Semper Sec, and God of all things compliance, and beard brother, as you can tell here. So we're twins here. So Rob, thank you for coming on this webinar with us, and hopefully we can get some interaction from our attendees, and they can ask you a ton of questions and really take advantage of the fact that we have a real expert here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm super excited to be here. And Art, thanks for having me. Feel free to ask questions, especially anything that you're particularly trying to hit, like you're dealing with StateRAMP, FedRAMP, TextRAMP, or you just want to know, how much I should budget for if I this is the thing, or like do I fit in this bucket? Like whatever it is, happy to give you kind of overall guidance on what we see out there.
Awesome.
So, yeah, I guess I can walk through Semper Sec. Basically, Art brought us on. Airiam is an awesome partner, and what the good part about what Semper Sec is like all we do is what I call the arts and crafts of cybersecurity. So we help customers implement and manage security programs that are aligned with a certain framework, in particular, for the most part. So it's either on the federal side, it's NIST 800 171, it's FedRAMP, StateRAMP, CMMC, or federal contract compliance, that side, or it's NIST, or it's ISO 27001, 27701, which is privacy, SOC 2, SOC 1, HIPAA, high trust, all the fun things that are out there. That's what we do. Basically, if you are hosting or holding on to some of your customers' data, you're probably our customer. But that's all we do. And the cool part is like working with Airiam and stuff like that is that we, since we don't sell software, if we recommend something to you, it's because it's in your best interest. We don't really care. We think you should go get it. And if you don't get it, that's fine.
Right. I think one of the real advantages of working with Semper Sec is that we don't have to pretend at Airiam to be compliance consultants. Every compliance has a lot of ins and outs, nitty gritty things that could trip us up. We're Airiam at its core. We're a bunch of operational technology geeks, and we need somebody like Semper Sec to help us get across the finish line here.
Yeah, and to echo that, like security is like medicine. Sometimes you need a heart surgeon, you need a brain surgeon, you need a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon. That's okay, right? In compliance, like you don't want to get somebody that's kind of done it. You want someone that's like been through the audits, knows exactly what they're dealing with, because like no one does this stuff for fun.
No. And do we even want to go through what our missions are? So Airiam, really, we're IT management, cybersecurity, and putting those together, we like to consider ourselves a resilience platform. With IT and cybersecurity, we give you the ability to be up and running and stay up and running. And Vivian, I don't know if you can go back to the slide with the mission for Semper Sec.
Oh, it's fine. I mean, our mission though is making it suck less. If I had to put it, I am the founder, so I can say what it is. But basically, reducing that FUD, that fear, uncertainty, and disorder, because like the cybersecurity industrial complex is strong. That's why we don't sell software. So if we tell you to get something, you should get it. If you don't, it's fine. But making it easier to operate, like making it less awful, making sure that your policies and procedures make sense, helping your business actually be more efficient, not just checking the block. So you're kind of getting that 2-for-1 deal.
Perfect. Awesome.
Cool.
All right. So yeah, Airiam has been in the news a lot. So we are a combination of a lot of MSPs and MSSPs that got together and have merged to be one super robot MSP. So we have a lot of capacity, a lot of capability. We have offices. Most of us are on the East Coast, but we have some in the Midwest as well. But we travel all over the place, and we handle clients remotely all over the country. All right. So what is RAMP?
Great question. So think of it as what it says right here: risk and authorization management program. So you have FedRAMP, which is when your customers are the federal government. You have StateRAMP when your customers are state and local governments. But essentially, both of them are NIST based. So as opposed to ISO or SOC 2, these are based off NIST standards, and it's basically how state and local organizations can consume cloud services in a safe way, believing that they're in a more secure manner.
Awesome.
So, and real quick, I want to make sure everyone who's listening to this call, you're in the right spot. So when you hear, and we just put XXX ramp, it almost sounds like a triple X ramp, which just sounds like something else. But think of it as this: there's people that host stuff, so software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Those are cloud service providers. You're going to be in the FedRAMP, StateRAMP buckets, right? Whereas you have companies that make welding rods, companies that make that provide services for the federal government. They fly things. Those are companies that are typically going to be in the NIST 800-171 or what's lovingly being called CMMC bucket, where you have controlled unclassified information. You may have ITAR information, so stuff that not allowed to be exported. You have stuff that the government has said, hey, it's not classified, but if you put the stuff together, it's going to be a big deal, right? So you do services, you build stuff for the government, and they've said, hey, you need to meet this standard. So that's a different webinar. So we're going to be talking about people that host stuff versus people that build stuff or do stuff for the government, if that makes sense.
And when you talk about hosting stuff, are we talking about exclusively technology platforms?
Yeah, so we're talking people that you might have either you might be building your own cloud infrastructure. So you could be like a data center that is building your own cloud infrastructure. So you have infrastructure as a service, something like that, or software as a service. So you want to sell GitLab or some company, some software to the government. It's a cloud service. So things like Gmail, that's a software as a service. It's hosted, right? Microsoft Office 365, it's hosted. Those are things that you have no physical infrastructure. So those are the things that if you have that type of software, that's where you fit in the right bucket.
Great.
So, and it can be all three levels, right? You can have people that have their build it all the way up versus people that take it and host it inside of Azure Gov, GC, Google Gov, AWS, wherever.
Awesome.
And one of the things to think about too is what do we compare? Because stuff starts showing up. You're like, what does all this stuff mean? So FedRAMP's your gold standard. You pass a FedRAMP audit, like a FedRAMP ATO. So that's basically what what you would do to get authorized. You pass that. That authorization is going to, or that audit is going to be transferable to StateRAMP and TexRAMP. That's kind of your gold standard, right? But there are things that you need to know where it applies, right? So if you have StateRAMP has reciprocity with TexRAMP, so that's not a problem. TexRAMP is good with Texas, all right? You can also use FedRAMP and StateRAMP with Texas. They also give you some additional ways to speed up the process. So if you have an ISO certification, that can get you faster. The only reason why I have ISO 27001 listed in FedRAMP is there is a direct mapping between the NIST standards and ISO standards, which is why I am a huge proponent of ISO. If you don't have a federal requirement, why it's a big deal, because there is a direct translation. So we can map those controls very cleanly, as opposed to going down a SOC 2 path where it depends on what point of focus you decided to meet, may or may not be good enough for what NIST is looking for, if that makes sense.
And I know I'm getting kind of ahead of us by asking this, but let's say you're thinking you may want to, your products may need FedRAMP down the road, but you don't have an active opportunity, and you don't have a sponsor for that right now. But you have a product that may go there down the road. So ISO 27001 opens you up to international clients as well. And so that may be something you can start now. You don't need a sponsor for, you don't need to have any kind of authorization ahead of time. So you can start down that road first. And then when you're ready for FedRAMP, it's a smaller nut to bite off maybe. Because
it's going to be, it's going to be slightly smaller. It's also going to, like, I would discount it. I would discount what I would charge for normal FedRAMP implementation, because like you already are running a program. Like you're going to get credit for that. You've got probably the basic controls in place that I don't have to worry about, which we'll talk about later, but 100%. Like, so the nice part about ISO is it's a heck of a lot cheaper, first of all, to get to the audit alone. So you should expect, just because we'll talk about it, a FedRAMP moderate audit, and this isn't my cost, these are what your 3 PAOs are going to charge. They can easily charge 150 to 200 grand. And like, they can charge that because if they're very good at what they do, it also means that you're going to have less problems later on with the different agencies and things like that. It means their audit means something. So you want to be careful with that, but it's not cheap, right? So knowing, like, but an ISO audit, that can be 20, 30 grand, it could be even less depending on your size, way easier to manage at a smaller scale. But it also really does prep you for it. And the nice part is because there's 27701, if you have a lot of PII, super easy. And then attaining like a SOC 2, like we only charge a little bit extra to help the customer do both, because in my mind, I'm just sitting through another audit. If we build the program right, it's easy. But that's a great question. Like, and the other thing, you brought up, Art, if you're not sure, right? One of the things you should consider is doing a workshop. So like, we'll do a workshop with a customer, as opposed to doing a full gap assessment. I don't necessarily need to do, because a FedRAMP gap assessment alone, if you go through all the controls and we do a full detailed gap assessment, like it can be 30, 45, 50 grand just to do the gap assessment. Whereas a couple grand workshop, spend an afternoon talking, we're generally going to know where you're at. It really depends on how fast you want to move and how far along you think you are. But if you know you're not super far, or everything's going to let's just have a discussion. It might save you a lot of time as well, because like it's a major investment. FedRAMP's not a joke. Like the good part is StateRAMP and TexRAMP have made things slightly less painful, and there are ways to navigate that. We'll talk about that later, of like how to move through it more efficiently.
Great.
Sorry, I get excited.
No, absolutely. All right, next slide.
Cool. So what are your levels, right? So super easy, high impact, like that's a big deal, right? High level, you're running classified, you're almost running classified systems. It's a much bigger deal. Most CSPs fall in that medium impact, where it could be severe if it was breached, but it's not, you're not holding nuclear codes. Your low impact, I don't see a lot of lows, to be honest with you. I see a lot of them, they're either tailored low impact SaaS, which is nice, because the tailored low impact SaaS, you don't actually have to do an ATO, or not ATO. You don't actually have to do a 3 PAO audit. You can self-attest, and you work with the agency on that on a one-on-one basis. So but that's something that, like, it's pretty rare, but it's things that, like, if there's no PII besides the login, essentially, like, you're in a good spot, right? That's a lot. That's much more. And that's where, like, if you have ISO, doing tailored low impact SaaS is pretty easy, because all you're doing is really modifying some templates and changing some vernacular. That's one piece of guidance I would give, is that, like, if you are an ISO shop or a SOC 2 shop, you have to, when you go into the federal space, like you got to use terms like plan of action and milestones, like POAM instead of like a risk treatment plan, which is another term people use because it's the government and their heads might explode if you terms they aren't familiar with, like just how it is.
I'm struggling to kind of picture what a low impact
So it would
program
be
that app might be.
battery charging.
Okay.
Like it could be let's say you're 3D printing and you print pictures of widgets. So it's just log in, stuff like that. Like that would be a low impact SaaS.
Okay, great.
But yeah, it's a good question though, right? So then here's your questions that you want to answer, right? Like, PII, low security impact. So like it's not going to cause harm from it being down, the data being breached, or the integrity being messed up. Like that's really what we're looking for is like, so it's not just it's not PII, but it's also does it hit the low, low, low all the way across the board, right? And is it hosted in a FedRAMP authorized spot? You also have to host it. You can't have your own data center. So that's a kind of the nuance of it, right? You need to have it in something that's already certified. But great question. Let's go to the next one here. Tips and tricks, right? All right. So common stuff, right? Documentation. So like a FedRAMP moderate, and this is where like you got to understand the investment, right? Like I tell customers, if you don't have, you need about a $500,000 budget if you're going FedRAMP moderate. Just because the cost of the audit alone, plus the system security plan, the template alone is like 500 pages. So easily you could have 1,000-page document by the end of it, and it's got to be written in FedRAMPese. Like, can't be not too verbose, not enough, not overly. Like, it's got to be just how they like it. And that's FedRAMP moderate. Not all the things are the effort, but that's there's a lot of work that gets involved with that, right? So making sure that customers have that understanding. Like that's what like, hey, if you don't probably have $1 million in opportunity and you are offering a SaaS platform that's that would probably be in the moderate bucket, you need to go back to the sales. And that's why sometimes we have the discussion. It saves them a lot of time and effort because it's like, is this real or not? Because like you got to go all in if you're going to do it.
Yeah, it might not be worth chasing the FedRAMP rabbit if you're not looking at making that much money off of the federal contracts.
Yeah, exactly. But again, policies, procedures, and making sure that like stuff's written for how the 3PO like stuff, knowing and working with a 3PO, right? So that's one of the advantages that people leverage Semper Sec for is we have relationships with 3POs that we use that like we know how they like stuff. And you can have that discussion ahead of time to make things a little bit smoother, which is much easier, right? And also making sure that you have a really a tight boundary, right? You know what the boundary is of your document. So there you go.
Awesome. Now for the 3PAO, is that decided by you or the customer? When are they able to pick their third party assessor or from a list, or is that something that's assigned by the agency?
Great question. So that is it's the customer picks it, right? You got to find somebody that's a certified 3PAO. We usually, if we're working with them, we tell them who we like, and it's up to the customer at the end of the day. We tell them like, hey, these are the ones we've worked with. These are the ones we have relationships with, so that it should be smoother. You can pick whoever you want. We don't care, but remember, this is a big, expensive thing. We want to add additional risks that's unnecessary, and I don't care. Like I don't. The auditors, there's no kickbacks involved in that because like they can't, like you would have ethical problems with that, but it's more of like who do I if you know how they operate and you know uh, who you're working with, you generally have a better feel for what is going to be sufficient, and you can have a better discussion with things, and make sure the customer's better prepared.
Right.
Um,
Less surprises.
Less surprises, right? And you also have an escalation point so that if you get an auditor that thinks they're on a quota, or somebody that's interpreting something in a way that generally is not how it's standard or controls interpreted, you know who to call to escalate to have a discussion. You could be wrong, and a finding's a finding, but being able to talk to somebody about it is hugely beneficial to work through an issue, figure out what does good look like if there is a problem. Because it happens. You have humans involved. But yeah, primary hurdles, changes to application architecture, if stuff's set up poorly, and that's where we try to help, do stuff differently. But you want to think about that in making sure your stuff's documented and that artifact. Like you can't have a just-in-time FedRAMP program. You need to have some evidence that the program's been functioning. Like it can't just magically show up. And then like budget and top cover, right? Like you need to make sure you have that. And then analysis paralysis, right? This is one that I've seen a lot, and we'll walk through this later. But I had a customer that was, they had spent a lot of time going, every single control, how long they thought that certain things were going to take to put in. And like, I went through it and I was like, no, this isn't going to take 40 hours. This is going to take 2, because like, this isn't a discussion. You have to do this. Like, there's no debate. Like some stuff you have to work through, but some stuff, no. And that's where having that guide will save you so much effort to go, this is good, go do that, moving on. Like, or we can't do that. How do we get around this? Having that discussion, but not just spending endless cycles.
Gotcha. Now, as far as the application, the architecture, you said changing it could be a hurdle. In order to meet, I guess, any kind of a finding, or
Yeah,
maybe
it
meet a
depends on
control.
like logging. You need to have good logging, and like what kind of credentialing or acts, like admin creds versus user creds. Like it's kind of basic software stuff, but making sure that like if those things aren't built in, then we gotta work through that. But it's making sure the logging is appropriate, right? And then your infrastructure, it's not that logging, but one of the requirements could be that depending on your level, like you need to fail closed if your logging stops. Well, have you architected your system so that because if depending on your platform, that might be okay,
Right.
But it also might not be okay because you're providing something that needs to be real time, like
Yep.
whatever the equivalent of a trading platform would be or something that like it's not down.
Right.
So yeah, good question. One of the things too that this is where uh, not to oversell Airiam on this, but this is where if you want to move faster, I I would use someone like Airiam to do like your vulnerability scanning. Like if you're not doing that stuff, have them do it. It'll move you. It's one less thing to worry about. Yes, you can do it yourself. You can go buy Nessus and you can go install it and you can go do all the things yourself. Absolutely. However, there's 300 something other things we need to worry about. So if we can get them at least scanning, giving you the report, getting that process functioning, where we're remediating and reducing that backlog. Because if you haven't been doing this or doing it in a mature manner or less than ideal manner, this is a chance to get that fixed using someone that can help you do the remediation, the controls. Like those are things that like I see people, they look at stuff and they're like, I can do all this. Yes, you can. You're right. You can do all these things. Should you? And is that what are the things that you can outsource versus you can? Like it might be they do the scans, you're doing the remediation because you can't let them into your system yet. Okay, that's cool. But at least getting maturity things and figuring out the aging, because like that's gonna be critical later on. Sorry, I just had to go in there.
No, absolutely. That's something that Airiam can definitely help with. We've been involved on a lot of projects where we've been rolling out authentication systems for people that needed a new authentication system that met requirements, rolling out new SIMs or logging systems, rolling out new firewalls and web application firewalls and things like that. So, a lot of times you look at the opportunity cost and list of stuff. Okay, vulnerability scan, controls list. There's a million things to do. What do you need to tackle with your internal team, and what can you pull in a partner to take care of?
Absolutely. Cool. Contract requirements. So we're talking about architecture review and contract requirements. Like essentially, one of the things you want to care about is what's in scope, what's out of scope, right? Think of it as like PCI for those of you familiar with credit cards. Like what is in this space versus what is not. And the less things that are in that space, the better. And then contract requirements. So as you're putting this stuff together, this is where having that sponsor is going to be huge. There may be things that they care about more than others. So we want to know what those are. Also, do you have ITAR? So like FedRAMP itself, there's one requirement for US persons, that's physical access, but it doesn't necessarily discuss everything, other types of access or non-US persons working in that space, right? So the reason why you have other contractual requirements you want to review that is as you're putting this thing together, are you going to have ITAR issues where you can't export to non-US persons? Like you need to know those things because there's no requirement that you have to have Americans the full stack, but there is requirements in different parts, and there may be additional requirements based on what you do. But there's nothing that stops an Israeli company, a German company, any company from doing FedRAMP. It's just depends on what type of data they have, right? And who has access. And like, it's one thing if like they have access to the code. It's another thing to have access to the data, right? There's different ways to work through that. So sorry, it comes up a lot.
No, that's good. Scoping is important. I know with other compliances it is too. Not everything may be something that FedRAMP has to apply to. And, like you mentioned with the global company, it may be something where the Atlanta office has to deal with this stuff and the rest of the company really isn't because it's a separate system. So FedRAMP could really apply to a product that is being offered rather than your whole system.
Yeah, you can have a multinational company with a product and you have US support personnel or US dev, or we figure out how to build a place where dev can play that's a sanitized environment, like so we can explain that no foreigner, no non-US persons have access to this type of data, but we have an ability to troubleshoot because your top developer is in India or Bangalore or someplace, like wherever they're at, right? Absolutely. Because like that's I think one of the hurdles people are like, well, we got foreigners. It's like, well, no, you can be a multinational and do this. It's fine. Like you have to figure out where the firewalls are.
Yep.
Cool. So let's talk about some showstoppers, right? So this is like this is GSA, but like this could apply to a lot of them, right? MFA, secure admin access. Like this is not these are things that like thou shalt. Like there's, like I said, there's 300 something controls, right? Or 122, depending on what level you're at. But these are things that aren't going to be debated, right? Like there's not like there's wiggle room on different things where, or not, maybe not wiggle room, but how you implement things there's different mitigation strategies, things like that. It might be like, hey, your secure your code repo is not in a FedRAMP environment, but it's in another SaaS, it's in some other environment. But we make sure that code is clean because we scan it before it hits the master branch. Like here's how we get around that issue, right? And okay, that might be acceptable, not a big deal, right? Again, if you're building an application to guard nuclear codes versus something else, right? It kind of depends on what the agency cares about. But vulnerability. So we talked about MFA. We talked about vulnerability, encryption, right? Data at rest, AES 256, 128. Those are the words. You gotta have containerization, integration, making sure you understand that. what multi-tenancy looks like, and making sure that you aren't using, this is where you have the multinational company, your office, in the US, you shouldn't have Huawei anyhow, because I think we're kind of against that. But, you got to recognize that, this is FedRAMP, right? Or StateRAMP. And one thing I always tell people, it's not called FunRAMP. It's called FedRAMP. As we're going through this is stuff that would apply if you were doing StateRAMP. It doesn't matter. These are things that are going to matter, right? You want to make sure you have stuff in the right buckets. This is the stuff they're going to care about. And if you don't have this, nothing else matters. But if you have this, we're moving on, right? Now we can have a discussion about not being perfect everywhere else.
Yep. Yeah. So these are general hygiene that are required really to have any kind of federal ticket in your hand. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. So, sorry, I just lost my screen here. Equivalency levels. This is real quick. Low, you have StateRAMP low, TextRAMP level 1, FedRAMP low, moderate. Just kind of gives you an idea of where the equivalency. So if you get a FedRAMP, you're good for this. Or if you have StateRAMP, it's going to cover you for TextRAMP. So there you go. And then there's also AZRAMP, which was the original impetus of what StateRAMP is. And the cool part about StateRAMP is if your government is not, or if your customer, if you're not selling the federal government, but you're selling the state and local, law enforcement, right? You're selling stuff that's CJIS controlled, right? Mm-hmm. So it's state and local, right? That's what's great about StateRAMP is StateRAMP has provided a way to do it faster and less bureaucracy, if you will, to some degree, where you can move through it a lot quicker, and for somewhat less cost, right? Depending on what level you are and things like that. And then of course Texas has their own because it's Texas. If you're, it is what it is. I went to college in Texas. I get it. So cool. Next one here. I get started. Yeah. You got to get a sponsor. You don't have to have a sponsor to start this stuff. And there is you can go FedRAMP ready where you can get listed on the marketplace and use that as your impetus. You can also do that with StateRAMP, right? You can get it to a certain level where you have a provisional where you're listed, so it might be what you need to have the discussion to find the rest of it, but it's still a lot of effort, right? So there still needs to be something substantive behind it, but that is a way to get up there. But you still, sorry, go on. We got Fed.
Well, what really is a sponsor when you're talking about this? Is it really your customer, or is it someone else that's kind of in an agency that is helping grease the wheels for you, or what's the deal?
So there's a couple of ways. A sponsor is going to be your end customer. So it's going to be Department of Indian Affairs, Department of Defense, the Air Force's whatever command, whatever, someone that wants to procure your services, and that will be ultimately, if you're going down the ATO, authority to operate path, which is what a lot of people start with, that's your fastest path to getting done. The other way is through, on the federal side, is through a JAB, and that's through a board. And you can go through that, but there's no guarantee anyone's picking up what you're selling. Mm-hmm. And that does take more time. But it's doable. And you can do that same with StateRAMP. You don't have to have a sponsor, but that's usually the fastest way to start recouping your investment.
Okay.
If that makes sense. But that's where I suggest, if you don't have one, getting to FedRAMP ready or StateRAMP provisional, I think that's what they call it. Those levels will at least will prove you're at a certain spot. And they can also review your package to see what you're working on. And it buys you a year of time to see, do I go through the rest of this? Do I go pay for the 3PAO audit, all those pieces? Because I'd be because the hardest part is you have to, and that's the hard part, is the security and IT guys are working on the program, but the salespeople, this is a joint effort. Mm-hmm. Sales has to figure out how to get to take it the rest of the way.
Yeah, yeah. I think the FedRAMP Ready, like you were mentioning, is kind of the solution for the chicken or the egg problem. Because
Mm-hmm.
what I see here is, okay, you need a customer to get FedRAMP, but you probably won't be able to sell your product and get a sponsor unless you're FedRAMP or you know, because it's a lot of time. It's a big runway of time here that you're talking about. So if you had a SaaS solution and you wanted to sell it to a government agency and you needed FedRAMP, um, you know, you may not be able to get a contract signed for until this whole process is over.
Absolutely.
So getting a sponsor means getting someone interested enough in your stuff that they want to stand behind you while you're going through this process, which it sounds like a really difficult thing if you're new to the game. Yeah,
Having a guide, and that's the other piece. Like whether you hired Semper Sec or you hired, and if you want somebody else, I'd tell you who else to go with if it wasn't us. I'm not going to say on this webinar, but you can call us because like they didn't pay me to advertise them. But at the same time, like you need help. Like you're not going to know. Like trust me, I was a Marine. Just ask me. We can do it. I can do it all. Hoorah! Doesn't doesn't mean I should. Like this, it'll speed you up to go. This matters, right? And having them write certain things so you can spend time on technical implementation or changes in process. So sometimes you got to hold somebody's hand while they change their password for the first time, or whatever it is. Like having help and the level of help you need might depend on your budget and your ability to execute. But typically, what I see is it's expensive on the front end, but then if you do it right, the follow-on maintenance is a lot less. And you should be able to do most of that stuff on your own, depending on what your staffing looks like. Sorry, go on. Yeah, yeah. And this is a sample timeline. And sorry, it just triggered me. The other piece about finding a guide is somebody who doesn't sell stuff, doesn't sell everything besides advice. Because the nice part about that is like, if I tell you to go use Airiam, I don't care. Like, are they the right fit for everything? Maybe not. I don't know. It depends on what you need. But somebody that can steer you in the right directions, that knows who to work with, is going to be huge, right? If we're trying to speed up things, like you look at this timeline, right? Like this is a timeline to do FedRAMP low impact SaaS, right? Still got 6 months. You're trying to move your butt off, but then you've also got we got to put in scanning, right? So that's one less thing. I go, hey, call Airiam, have them run your scans, have them do this. This will move faster here. Those are going to do this because those are people that we know how to work with. We know how to move faster. We need multi-factor. Why figure this out on your own? Let's go use these people for this. Like, let's go use Airiam. Let's go use that. Like, whoever it is that makes sense. But like at the end of the day, making sure that they know who to call, and they don't have to be experts at everything. It's almost better that they're not, because they can go, this is the expert. This guy will get this in fast. I don't have to deal with it. Right. Um, sorry. And this is just a sample timeline. I've got plenty of other timelines. Anybody's watching this stuff in the comments, feel free to ask for other ones. But basically, like think of it this way, like this one's kind of got a low impact. So it's like these are the things that matter, and then additional changes. It's not that there's not other changes, but there's things that like are the long poles in the tent versus things that like I can't mess around with. So let's go to the next slide. All right. We only have a few minutes, we got about 10, 20 minutes left. I don't know how you want to do this one, Art.
yeah. I'd say probably just if we can just skip over all the slides and maybe just click through them. And I don't know if there's any specific ones that you want to speak to, but maybe just show and tell the slides rather than
Yeah,
dive into each one.
sure. So these are basically 32 things that matter, particularly for StateRAMP, but they're also going to matter for FedRAMP. Again, these are things that like are showstoppers, things that like we're not having a debate on, things you need to do. So let's go. So encryption, you need to have encryption, right? AES 256, 128, TLS, like for the customers that you're still allowing 1.1, like, hey, that's not going to work in this space. So you might have to put it in a different one. Like we're not doing that. Like it's insecure. We're got to move on. Next. Sorry, I'm swiping right on this thing here.
Absolutely.
Vuln management. That's what I talked about, having people do that. Like, do you consistently remediate high vulnerabilities in 30 days, mediums in 90 days, and lows in 180? No one does lows in like usually ever, much less 180 days. So like having help with remediation is going to be critical, right? And also, what'll be useful too is when you can't patch something or do the configuration because it breaks something, having somebody demonstrate, like, do that test. And so you have evidence so that when you are saying, hey, we can't remediate this, here's our mitigation, but here's why we can't, you have evidence, right? And you want someone that, when they're doing the service for you, understands that anything that you can't remediate, we have to have a plan on how we're dealing with it. Not just, and that's where doing it on your own is great, but having extra brains in the operation may be more useful, especially someone that can do that right up for you. Here's how we mitigated it.
Yeah, whether you're
Next
pulling
one.
in us or somebody else, like make sure that you're asking for that kind of SLA agreement around the, like, let's say you're having somebody patch all your lows. Make sure that they know they have to have it patched within X days, and that if there's something that they can, if a mitigation plan, explanation, evidence, etc. Awesome.
Yeah, and that piece, like, I would tell you, is like, I understand the paranoia of letting people get in there and do vulnerability management because patching configuration can shut down stuff, right? But as Art said, have them start with the lows, have them work their way up, start with proof of concept, validate that trust, right? And have them start aiding in as you feel comfortable with their ability to execute and test and validate, because like you're gonna need help. But remember, it's vuln management too. It's not patch management, because like you'll hear people, they'll deploy the patch, but they forget to do the config and disable SMB1s, whatever it is, and like the scan still shows up, and like, I don't understand why. Never seen that before. So, and then logs, right? Like, you got to have logging. This is what we talked about, like changes in the system, right? Do we have this stuff? Do you have to have a sim? No, but you need to have some sort of log aggregation, right? Next, DNS. DNS is a thing. Moving on. This shouldn't be too much of a debate. Access, right? So we're talking MFA, valid attempts, SSO, SAML. Like, you need to figure out how you're accessing stuff as well as how your customer would access stuff. Do you integrate with their SSO, or how can they use PK? Like, how are they going to access your software as a service? Can we integrate into their system? Right. So there's two parts of access control, and then information flow. Like, you separate your customer data. We're not commingling stuff that doesn't like to share. Next, this is easy. I'm swiping right. Malware. Yeah, we should, now that doesn't mean you have to try to figure out how to put like CrowdStrike on, or on ephemeral, on Kubernetes, and some ephemeral container or something that doesn't like, but you need to talk about how you harden stuff, right? For malware. Like, it's hardened, it's done this with trusted libraries, like those type of things. It doesn't always have to be a piece of software. Because like, if you're doing DevSecOps where it doesn't make sense, it's like the ephemeral. How do I put this on some ephemeral thing that doesn't exist?
Right. If you're running serverless code in the cloud, and you don't have a server to run AV on, CrowdStrike on, do you have another mechanism to be able to log if something's going on? Yeah.
And how you defeat that malware, right? And one thing I would recommend too is, you talk about serverless code and like DevSecOps. Change management doesn't mean change meeting. Fun fact. But it is not. You need to know how you're going to demonstrate compliance with change management, because we're going to hit that pretty quickly here. That's where, like, having true policy enforcement, like, what if you're going to override the system, what's required to do that? Like, you basically, the idea is you can't push your own code without some sort of mechanism. But audit, you got to be able to do audit. That's easy. Next, it's not much of a debate. Disaster recovery, right? Like, what's your plan for that? And it depends. This is not necessarily, do you have to run HA? No, like, if you're not running, depends on what the availability is required, right? Next, And if you got questions, Art, feel free. I don't want
I was
to.
just saying, yeah, your DR requirements may be based off of your contract with the customer
Mhm.
rather than, FedRAMP. FedRAMP's looking for your DR plan or DR exists. Your customer may be the one requiring some certain amount of
Yeah,
uptime.
and you got to think about like what are you selling? What logically makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? So yeah, inventory. You got to have the inventory. That's easy. Uh, Change control. We just talked about that, right? Do you have a way to detect those changes? What's the formal process? You know, uh, you know, how do we do this stuff, right? Like, what are you enforcing technically on a like a what's it called, like a Veracode or a sonar cube, uh, things that like do static code analysis. Like, what are you enforcing and not allowing people just to bypass? How do you want to manage that, right? So you don't have unauthorized changes and configuration, right? Like on those things. So there you go.
Yep. And when you're working with service providers too, having a change management system that includes them is important because we might be configuring something in Azure for you. And, if your change management system is completely separate from us, we may be making changes that are not getting tracked in your system.
Oh, and that brings up an amazing point too. When you're using a service provider, access control. So this is where you need to work with your service provider and be transparent with them and have that trusted relationship where you go, hey, unless you can show me and demonstrate like who's got access to my password, and you can show who, like through their bastion hosts, and like we know who accessed what when, like tell them, hey, if you need 4 accounts for these 4 individuals, let me know. If someone rotates out, that's fine. I'm not going to judge you because you've had some turnover. Like having those kind of communications is critical, because like if they're using a shared account, like shared accounts are not your friend. So like they still have to be able to show this, then like it's going to all be auditable. So making sure you have those communications with your MSSP and go like, how do y'all want to do this? Like, because like a good service provider is worth its weight in gold. You don't want to throw them away because like they're using a shared account. It's where you have the discussion. Okay, how many people are really going to be working on my stuff? Okay, how many accounts do I need to provision, or do you have a way to prove this? And can we that'll be auditable? You understand? Like we're all on the same page, because that be could be a huge pain in the ass later on. Pain in the butt. Sorry for those of you gentle people. Uh, so next, yeah, it's easy. Uh, um, Figs, least functionality. You don't turn on stuff. Control maintenance, flaw remediation. Um, IR, you got to do their testing, but that should be part of anybody's um, program. And if you want to see fun things like that, we'll do that sometime. Does SP configuration management plan, emergency plan, telecoms? What are you doing? Making sure it's fully tested, stuff like that, right? And that's where we're working with your service provider too. Like that's the thing is like depending on how much stuff you've outsourced, you may have to set up a separate environment. And working with them, like again, like I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater just because you're set up a certain way. Like if you have an MSP that is good at what they do, work with them to figure out how to do it. And that's where that guide comes in of like, okay, it's not oh no, we're going to lose the contract. Everyone's working together, because it's not like it's going to get easier if you try to go hire people that like cost a whole lot more and probably aren't as proficient anyhow. So having painfully been through that too. Yeah. Next, backups. Yeah, you got to back up your stuff, test it. Right. This shouldn't be that hard, but these are things that like people are like, well, we have some backups. I'm like, okay, but you actually have to test it, right? Next, dev, trying to develop code testing, right? We talked about that. That's the thing is like there's a couple of things that kind of hit multiple buckets sometimes, depending on what you're doing, make it easier for you to move through it. And as Art said, like the federal space, your federal product, if you're a multinational, you have multiple products, like this might become a kind of an enclave inside of the rest of your organization if necessary. You try to want to, like, there's nothing in here that you shouldn't want to do for all your SaaS products. However, there's only so much change an organization can absorb. And if you've acquired a bunch of different products and now you have, like, you're one big company with 3 different dev teams, that might be why you have to figure it out a little bit differently. Next, FedSec. So this shouldn't be a major issue for most people, but you don't need to worry about it if you're hosting it in AWS, Azure, Google, wherever, someplace that's already FedRAMP accredited. Well, personnel security, exit interviews, right? Making sure you're shutting stuff off, shutting off. That's where like ISO comes into play. Like a lot of these things are all ISO controls as well. So having these things, the only difference is ISO may not mandate 30 days for highs and criticals, but like that's a good standard because your customers are going to require it anyhow. But there's nothing in here that like wouldn't be required by ISO or something else. That's what's nice about, as you said, as you mentioned earlier in the webinar, like having something in front of you will make it a lot easier to deal with.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of overlap here between what I've seen.
Yeah, and remember, now we're only hitting, a subsection of the 300 something possible or 400 something controls, but at the end of the day, like these are the things that, like, if you hit these things and we have policies and procedures in place, like we're a lot farther along. Like we're really spending time writing the SSP and just proving that the program's functioning.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Now you mentioned SSP. Is there usually a different SSP that you're presenting for different compliance programs, or are you usually trying to generalize and kind of combine everything into one thing so you're not having to juggle SSPs?
Good question. Typically, a FedRAMP, like a FedRAMP moderate SSP, is its own animal all into itself, which is really designed for describing a system to an agency sponsor or to the FedRAMP auditor. Like those are listed on there, and not everybody has access to it because it's got some very detailed information, stuff that like I wouldn't necessarily tell all my other customers. But I would create a modified version. It's a good question though. Like you create a modified version, but you do want to try as best you can try to run one program with, you can have addendums or exceptions for this type of data, or using data classification, things like that, to like carve out where the rules are more specific. But it should make sense, right? Like you should do that with any program. That way you're not guarding some, marketing data. Like this webinar is not G14 classified. Like,
right.
We don't need man traps in our offices to do this. But yeah, and then external support, right? So like ongoing services, remediation, technical remediation, right? Like this is where, like, using someone like Semper Sec, but also using someone like Airiam, like, because there's gonna be things, and that's the piece that I would recommend. If nothing else, if you take nothing else away, if you're looking for external help, find somebody who's worked with organizations your size and understands what's going on. You don't want, no offense to Boeing. Boeing's a great company, but the security manager from Boeing is going to build you a program for Boeing. That's a massive company. And if you're not Boeing, you're going to be really, it's not going to make any damn sense.
Yep. And so if you're working with an MSP and or MSSP along the way, also, work with somebody who's used to dealing with clients of your size.
And someone's working with, and someone's used to working with MSSPs or MSPs that knows how to deal with them and isn't a threat. because like the biggest challenge you sometimes see is you'll see a bunch of like posturing, because like one, the MSP is afraid of looking bad, right? Because the compliance guys are coming in, they're going to be poking holes. Like, so having good relationships where like we can admit like nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we got to work on. This is what we need to fix. Like that's what everyone's looking for. So
Right. On a new program, there's no reason to worry about looking bad. You're gonna look bad. Like on a new program, you're gonna run yourself against those controls, do that gap analysis, and you're gonna fail. Like, so there's no reason to fear having those holes poked. But yeah, no, definitely some people are afraid of that.
cool.
Awesome. So we have some upcoming webinars as well, where we're going to discuss, SOC and ISO and NIST 800-171. Now, one question that came up was you had mentioned the GCC high. If you're using public cloud, let's say you're running a SaaS company, just as an example, but it could be anything, some kind of software, and you're running it in public cloud, and you're going for FedRAMP. A lot of times they'll tell you that you need to be in GCC high or something like that, depending on what the nature of the data and what the customer is. When it's a state agency and you're going for StateRAMP instead of FedRAMP, is there any kind of equivalent to that they require, or is public cloud okay then?
Public cloud's okay for both.
Yep.
Okay. It just depends on, like, there's some extra stuff you got to do to configure the public cloud, and it depends on what you have. Like, the nice part about if you use the DoD cloud or the Gov cloud, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever that is, you inherit certain controls, so you get a little bit. It's a little bit less to deal with. It's a little bit less like things to deal with, but you can still do it, like, depending on what you have, right? Like, I wouldn't say if you're doing FedRAMP high, you should go public cloud. I don't think that's going to work out so well. But
right,
yeah, absolutely. Like the equivalent would be is like either doing it where you're at, but if sometimes it makes sense to put it in a separate environment. But what sucks about those environments, like, I don't know your experience, but I feel like you pay twice as much for like half the features. So it's like it's also, you got to ask yourself, how much justice can you afford? If you say you're in federal, Azure Gov, whatever, AWS Gov, like the auditor kind of goes away. There's less questions. If you say you have Qualys or Tenable Nessus as your scanning solution, auditor goes, like, there's things that like the auditor will go, okay, cool, moving on. Like, okay, like, so it's like, does it make it easier? Sure, but the auditors, they're going to go check a few other things, but it'll be fine.
Okay, great. So really, as long as you have your ducks in a row and you're conquering those controls and you're able to show evidence behind your vulnerability scanning, pen testing, et cetera, not being in the Gov Cloud may be okay depending on the kind of data you have. I believe if you have certain kinds of data, they're probably going to insist, but and it may be the client insisting rather than the auditor.
And that's where yeah. Working with your client, right? That's where getting yourself to FedRAMP ready, but then because once you get that customer, they may say, no, I could, like, something you hadn't considered. So like I can't get into this, but the customer, they had some kind of what didn't seem like a big deal is, like, let's say it's like step tracking, right? I'm just going to use a general term, right? But like what it could have shown is it could have shown the general fitness level and location of military units all over the globe. Like, all of a sudden we went from moderate to high because like the way they looked at it was like, oh, that's a much bigger deal than you think. Yeah. So like, because it's like, who cares? It's just tracking their steps, like, not a big deal. It's like, no, we're tracking their fitness level across the world. Oh, yep. Oh, that's the thing. Like,
There's probably
So
other intelligence you get from it, like how many and where they are, but yeah. Awesome.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. I don't know if we have any more slides here. Probably not.
I think we're good.
Yes, our last. We're going to post this on YouTube and link to it on LinkedIn, etc. So those of you who are catching it later, feel free to ask any questions. Here's the contact information for Semper Sec, and here's ours. Feel free to reach out. Don't be a stranger. Both Rob and I love to geek out on this stuff.
Yes, we do. Thank you all.
Thank you.